Communication is a big topic. There's a communication studies department at Cal Poly. There are a lot of communication classes you could take. So we are talking about a particular kind of communication here. We're talking about interpersonal communication, communication between two people. Furthermore, interpersonal communication that is aimed at capturing subjective filters, at talking about underlying worldviews. This is not at all the same as public speaking. You could take a Toastmaster class that teaches you how to speak in front of a crowd, and it's there's a lot of great insights to be had. It's lots of techniques that are useful, but that's not what we're talking about here. So not that I'm saying that, again, those other ways, those other approaches to communication are not useful. I just want you to understand we're not talking about that. In fact, some of the rules that, or some of the techniques that you employ when you have one-on-one conversations might contradict what the type of communication you would engage in when you are giving a speech. There's also another kind of communication that you probably have learned a lot in your education so far, which is communication aimed at convincing somebody else that you're correct. Right? So let me demonstrate, like a competitive, when you have two people give a speech and speech debate, debate classes, right? The type of stuff right now we see the ramping up to the presidential election. The kind of speech that politicians engage in when they have a debate is a type of communication where you're trying to prove the other person wrong, prove your points correct. That's often what happens at work as well. You're trying to convince others that you're right. If you engage in sales, you're trying to give a sales speech to show that your product is the best or your service is the best, and hide its flaws and dominate the other person, right? So that's very common. That's a type of communication that is so common that we often adopt it by default. And the type of communication that I'm talking about here is not that. Now, I'm not saying that there's no place for debate or convincing or sales. There is a lot of place for that. It's a very useful skill to have. But it's also very important to be able to leave it aside and say, now I'm going to engage in another kind of communication, a kind of authentic communication, where I don't hide the flows of my arguments, where I don't try to dominate the other person, where I don't try to be right, where I try to have a empathetic understanding of where the other person is coming from. So you had a reading on this already. In a way, the type of communication we're talking about here is very much the type of communication that happens between a therapist and their patient, or in group therapy, or in couples therapy, or in communication that happens between two very good friends that are trying to help each other. The reading you had was called, I think it was helping. It was about helping relationships, right? I forget the title now. The Carl Rogers reading, right? You guys, was it assigned for today? I think so, right? So the idea of like, how do you put yourself in the shoes of another person so that you understand their worldview? Very useful skill to have, because you can have so many debates, disagreements, conflicts that are really rooted in the fact that you have different filters and you don't know how to talk about those filters. You're completely eluding that big aspect that originated the discussion. So here's a few principles that I suggest are useful in engaging another person so that you understand their worldview. The first rule or norm is to realize that bias is inevitable. You are biased, other people are biased. And in fact, again, another term for bias is filter. So you have to have filters to make sense of reality. So you can't not have filters. So really suspending blame and judgment when we realize other people see things differently than me, accept that it's normal. Of course they would see things differently than me. They have a different life story They have different values. They have gone through completely different sequence of events. They're sensitive to different things. I might not be shocked by a certain word, and somebody else might be shocked by it. We had an example in the T group. Like, for example, we were talking about fake, right? The word fake was like some people were, I didn't think it was a bad word, and other people were like, that makes me react strongly. I don't like to hear that word. It sounds like a bad word to me. So that's an example of how the different kinds of filters we have, right? So realizing I am not infallible. I'm not the smartest and the most objective. This is particularly important for us here in this room, because I'll emphasize this, and I think I can say this without flattering you. All of us in this room, we are smart people. We are here because we have usually been smarter than our peers. We used to be the smarter one, the more logical one. And so eventually we kind of like tend to stop questioning the fact that we are the smartest one. And letting go of that doesn't mean that you're not smart. It's just saying, okay, let's accept. I'm smart. I'm going to stop always trying to prove it at any minute. Now I'm going to look at something else than that. What is the filter of the other person? When somebody, a common response, if somebody sees things differently than me, I'm like, oh, that person is either stupid or malintentioned, naive maybe. Like, rarely do I say, oh, that person has a different filter than me. So, if you can adopt this other attitude of like, oh, how did that person come to a completely different conclusion than I did, experiencing the same moment? And if you can be curious and playful and flexible, that's the second point, you're like, I'm really curious about what kind of life story, what kind of filters lead another person to see things differently. So curiosity is not something some people are more curious than others naturally. I don't know how much you can develop, you can cultivate that. But you can have it as a mindset of like, when I tend to shut down or be shocked, can I transform that into curiosity? Can I say, that person did something that I don't understand. I'm curious. Why, where does that come from? Where is that reaction coming from? We'll talk a lot about active listening and empathetic listening today. Empathetic listening is a very, very useful skill to have. So can you devote your entire being to another person so that you hear not just what they're saying, not just their words, but the feelings associated with them, the nonverbal expressions, the unsaid stuff, and so that you get a feel, a sense for what the other person is experiencing. Quite often when we listen, we tend to only listen with a very narrow channel that tends to be focused only on the logical, rational side, especially at work. So can you expand the channels? Can you open up the channels and realize what else is going on? Building self-understanding, it takes two people. It's a two-way street. That's where this approach diverges from psychoanalysis or psychologists. In a psychology patient's relationship, there's a one-way kind of relationship where the therapist listens but doesn't share stuff. But when you have a relationship with somebody else that becomes intimate, and I don't mean in a romantic way, you can have an intimate relationship with friends or with colleagues. When you have a deeper understanding and trust of another person, both people exchange and make themselves vulnerable to each other. So in fact, if you don't reciprocate, if I make myself vulnerable to you by revealing something about myself that might make me feel vulnerable, that I might not normally share, that has the potential to increase trust. But if I'm alone in my vulnerability, just having laid something out there, and you don't reciprocate and you keep your poker cards up, right? That's not going to be conducive to trust. So usually, it takes the other person to share something in return to make themselves vulnerable as well. And when both people share stuff that makes each other vulnerable, trust emerges. So trust is an essential component of understanding other people's worldview. Trust, non-judgment, the desire to help others instead of judging them and harming them or dominating them. I like to explain trust with the example of the handshake. So the origin of the handshake, as I believe, as I've heard, comes from princely periods in Europe, medieval times, where men would carry a sword at all times, or a dagger on their left side here. And if you met a stranger, potentially you could have a fight with your sword, a sword fight. So if let's say you were walking in a forest on the road, there were a lot of people that might attack you, so you would be ready to grab your sword and defend yourself at any moment. So the handshake was designed to signify that I'm not going to take my sword. So you extend your hand, you meet a stranger in a dark alley, you extend your hand, that means my hand is not here on my dagger, it's right there. So I'm not taking my sword, I'm taking a risk, I'm taking a chance on you, because obviously, if you put your hand on your sword, what you signify is distrust, right? And potential conflict, and it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, it's kind of like the Jesus, extend the other cheek as opposed to, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. I extend my arm. That by doing so, I make myself vulnerable. You have a lead on me if you have your hand there to attack me first. But by taking that chance, I'm asking you to reciprocate and extend your hand as well. And we shake hands, and that means that's it. We're not gonna. We've decided we've established a minimum basis of trust. We're not going to be dragging our swords, here. So I will say some people are more trusting than others. Depending on your life story, you might find yourself more or less trusting. But don't count on others to take the first step. Be the ones who take the first step. That's something that I've learned in my life. Be the one who extends their hands first, who makes yourself vulnerable, who shares something, and continue until the other person starts to reciprocate. And that's how you establish community. Now, some people will never respond in kind, will always remain distrustful, and sometimes it doesn't work. But if you really want to understand somebody else's worldview, you have to do that. Trust in one-on-one relationship and in teams I think of it as magic. It's magic, and it's a very, very valuable quality of relationships. Related to trust is love. Loving somebody else means that you don't want to harm them, that you want to help them, you want them to be happy, you want them to be successful, you want them to fare well. There's different kinds of love. You can have love in friendship, in family, romantic love. But really, so it's the idea that I'm not trying to compete and dominate and win over another person, take advantage of another person, but the opposite. I'm trying to have kinship, where I'm willing to sacrifice some of my well-being, some of my goals. I'm happy to do that to help another person achieve their goals. And I will say that's a fundamental aspect of societies that work well. Democracy and trade. The fact that having a country where we are not in civil war, where we mainly interact in a civilized way. Take a place like San Luis Obispo. What makes San Luis Obispo an amazing, happy place is, you go around in the street and you don't expect people to attack you. It's very safe. People tend to be pretty happy. People tend to want to help you in the street. There's a basic level of trust that exists here, which there's a lot of other places in the world where it's not like that. You in fact expect to be attacked at all times. That creates a completely different kind of society. So when you are working in organizations, if you can create trust, if you can not create, you can't create trust. You can only set the initial conditions so that trust emerges. The same way that you cannot create love, you can yourself make yourself vulnerable, make some overtures, make some gestures, and let the magic happen. Trust is very easy to destroy, very hard to build, but very easy to destroy. So one betrayal, one person, one bad apple, taking advantage of, you have a group where trust exists, you have one person come in and take advantage of that, it really can destroy the trust very quickly. That's why, like, for example, that's why I hate marketers who abuse friendship circles, like the people who try to sell you Mary Kay products, or this kind of marketing where you try to sell stuff to your friends. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. Marketing schemes. To me, that's like you are abusing the benevolent trust network of friendship for a commercial purpose, and thereby you destroy trust. You make it less likely. Now, if you invade my circle of friends with those kind of demands, then you're weakening the whole thing. You're taking advantage of it. So I don't want you to do that. I don't want that to happen. That's a mild example of that. A worse example of that is people making other kind of abuses. Owning your feelings. I put it there. I could have put it somewhere else. Very, very useful in interpersonal communication to own your feelings. So we've been practicing this in the T groups. Owning your feeling means that, let's say somebody did something that makes you feel hurt, betrayed, angry. It's so common for us to say, you made me feel mad. You did this. That's not owning your feelings. That's owning your feelings is saying, I am mad as a result of something you did. That doesn't, that seems to potentially imply that you did something that had an effect on me, but I'm owning the fact that my emotion is mine, is my own creation, it's not yours. That's a very subtle distinction. One thing I learned, a very key lesson I learned sometime in the middle of my psychoanalysis. I used to be afraid that I tend to be very sensitive to hurting other people. So it makes me feel very bad when I do something that makes somebody mad, sad, upset. And then it took me quite a while to realize when somebody else feels a strong emotion, quite often it doesn't have that much to do with me. Believing that I 100% caused it, in a way, like, is believing I have much more power than I have. So the history of a person has at least as much to do with what they're feeling than what I did. So our actions tend to trigger emotions in others. Other people's emotions trigger emotions in us, but they don't cause them fully, right? So, let's say, like, if I grew up in a situation where people always made fun of me, right, and I became sensitive to that damaged my self-esteem, and you make a joke, friendly, like you have no bad judgment of me, but you make a joke at me and I react really, like, upset, right? Are you responsible? Am I responsible? Well, your action triggered something. Maybe your intention was to build rapport, say, hey, we're friends, we're joking around. But my reaction is due to my past, but you triggered it, right? So that's kind of like, that's what I'm getting at. But there's many other ways. So owning your feelings, there's many other ways in which this happens. So owning your feelings is a way to realize, to pause and to take responsibility for your filters and for your past. Now, when other people dump things on you and say, you made me feel that way, it's also very important, you can't teach other people to be more responsible for their emotions, but you can resist taking ownership. Somebody said, you made me feel that way. You can say, I'm sorry, I can see you feel that way. I'm sorry you feel that way. But you don't have to say, yes, I made you feel that way. I can see how what I did provoked strong feelings in you. Now, I think it's much easier to accept, to communicate when you don't feel completely responsible for making somebody else feel either good or bad. That it happens in good ways as well. Like romantic relationship is a great example of that. You make me feel great. You make me feel whole. You are so important to me. Now that's much easier to hear that. Don't fully buy it either. That's another person sort of idealizing you when they say that. So it can feel good, but it can also lead later to disappointments when the other person realizes that it's not you entirely. It's like part of it is like what they want to see. It's their filters as well. So owning your feelings, very important skill.